The initial college football playoff rankings have been released. Nick Saban tests positive for COVID-19 for real this time, and I preview the Egg Bowl and each of the College Pick'em Week 10 matchups. I'm Jay Smith, and this is After Further Review.
And now, after further review, a Clemson student's perspective on sports.
And a personal foul on number 99 of the defense after he tackled the quarterback. He's giving them business down there. That's a 15-yard penalty.
Well, welcome in, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm Jay Smith, and yes, this is After Further Review. Happy Thanksgiving to all of you out there. Who knows, by the time you might be listening to this episode, Thanksgiving may have come and gone, but it is the day before Thanksgiving, and I'm excited for Turkey Day tomorrow. I'm excited. I've needed something to look forward to these last few months. Classes have wrapped up for me, and it's a weird feeling being finished this early, being finished before December rolls around, but without that fall break, it certainly is nice. So, again, happy Thanksgiving to everybody out there. But college football is still chugging along. There's been tons of cancellations, right? We've had over 25 games the last couple of weeks that have been either postponed or canceled. We've highlighted many of them on the show. But the college football playoff rankings are here, and they came out last night. And listen, we're going to talk about these extensively. That's going to be the major discussion, I guess, of this show. There weren't really many surprises to me. Now there are a few, and we'll get to them in a second. But let's talk about this top four, because I think that's where the most intrigue is, or maybe even the top six, right? Listen, Alabama at 1, no surprise. I don't think anybody was shocked by that. Shouldn't be. Had some issues earlier this season. Certainly when Ole Miss played them. The Rebels took them to the wire. They looked a little bit soft on defense. They've cleaned up their issues, and I think Alabama right now is in their driver's seat, right? They're in the driver's seat in the SEC West, and they should make it to an SEC championship game. And I think at this point it's a safe bet to assume that they take care of business against Florida and whoever it may be. I don't think Florida has officially locked up the East yet, but either way, Alabama's looking strong right now. Number 1, no controversy. Where things do get kind of interesting is at number 2. Now, Notre Dame is number 2 in both the AP poll and the college football playoff rankings. I remember when Notre Dame beat Clemson, they jumped. I think they jumped Ohio State, right? Because Notre Dame would have been 4, I think, at the time of that game, and they jumped up to third. They jumped to second. They jumped to second because Clemson dropped down to 4th. Alabama went to 1st, and instead of Ohio State moving from 3rd to 2nd, Notre Dame leapfrogged them. Well, the Irish come in at 2nd in the college football playoff rankings. They're 8-0, the only 8-0 team in any Power 5 conference. You do have Cincinnati sitting there at 8-0 from the American, and then obviously you have BYU at 9-0, and we'll talk about BYU. Trust me, we're going to get to BYU in a second. But Coastal Carolina is also 8-0. Marshall is 7-0, but again, Notre Dame the only 8-0 team from a Power 5 conference, because again, the Fighting Irish are in the ACC this year. I don't think this is too controversial. I think Notre Dame right now is playing like the second best team in the country. Setting aside the fact that I think if Clemson rematches Notre Dame in an ACC championship game and Clemson's fully healthy and they have Trevor Lawrence and they have all their stars back on defense, I don't think it's going to be very close. I think right now, Notre Dame should be at number 2. Where we're seeing the most controversy is around this 3rd spot. Now, a lot of people think that Ohio State was deserving of this 3rd spot, and I don't necessarily agree with this. And I know I'm rocking my, I got my Clemson shirt on. For those of you who are watching on Facebook, you can see it. If you're listening to the podcast, obviously you can't. But look, I don't think the resume of Ohio State has surpassed Clemson yet. Now, the Indiana game this past weekend was a good measuring stick. And I talked about that on last week's show. I said, hey, listen, this is going to be, I think, a good game. It should be a close game. I think Indiana played they played a little tight. I feel like there were a lot of mistakes. Michael Penix, their quarterback, wasn't quite as on the money as I had seen from him earlier this season, and you could tell that Indiana understood the gravity of the situation. They understood the importance of the game, the significance of the moment, and they really just weren't able to capitalize. There were a lot of things that went against them, and when you're playing a team like Ohio State on the road, you have to be perfect. You have to be perfect. Everything has to go your way and then some, and it just didn't for Indiana. But you have to give the Hoosiers credit. They kept it close, and they fought the entire game. And I actually saw a couple of clips from the post-game speech from the Indiana's head coach. His name is escaping me at the moment. But, he basically said, listen, guys, we competed. We showed up here with a can't-be-denied attitude, and we played our hearts out. We left it all out on the field. So, again, you got to credit the Hoosiers. However, from a talent point of view, they are not on the same level as Ohio State is. I don't think there's really anybody that would dispute that. I mean, if there's someone out there who honestly thinks that Indiana is just as talented as Ohio State, you're delusional. You're delusional. Ohio State's the more talented team. Ohio State should have won that game, I think rather easily and by a more substantial margin than they did, right? I mean, this game was fairly close. So, again, when you're talking about resumes, and you're talking about, who's played who and how they've looked. I mean, again, Clemson to start out this season was so hot. I mean, they were consensus number one team in the country. They looked unbeatable, especially when they were going up against Miami, a few weeks into the season. I think that was week 4, I believe, for them. Yeah, it was the 4th game of the season for Clemson, and that 42-17 victory. I mean, the Tigers were just on fire. Now, a lot has happened. And actually, really, the most significant month for Clemson was, I would say this past one, because they played Miami on October 10th. And so, they had the Georgia Tech game after, right? That they won that one 73-7. But it was the Syracuse game in mid to late October where things kind of started to slip. You had Syracuse 47-21, but we all remember how close that was, especially in the third quarter. And then Boston College was a nail-biter. A nail-biter at home. And then obviously the Notre Dame game that took double overtime for the Fighting Irish to prevail. Clemson's resume on the surface, I mean, the easiest thing is to say, well, Clemson's won more games. Right, you can just sit here and say, okay, Clemson is, compare them right next to each other. Clemson's 7-1, Ohio State's 4-0. Clemson has wins against Wake Forest, the Citadel, Virginia, Miami. They have wins against Syracuse, Georgia Tech, Boston College, and they have the loss to Notre Dame. Now, when you look at Ohio State, we've talked about this Indiana game, right? We talked about Indiana and the fact that it ended up being close. It was a 42-35 win for the Buckeyes. But look at the other games. You've got Nebraska, 52-17. They looked slow, right, on offense, especially in the first half. They ended up coming alive, similar to Clemson's performance in the Syracuse game. It took them 2 quarters, but they were able to prevail, and they won by a substantial margin. Now, you can do that against a Nebraska. You can do that against a Syracuse. Can you do it against an Alabama? Can you do it against a Florida? Can you do it against a Cincinnati or a BYU? I don't think so. I think you need to group BYU and Cincinnati in that discussion because those teams are dominant, capital D dominant this season. So, for the Buckeyes, right, in the Nebraska game, then Penn State on the road, that was a little close. Now, we thought at the time, okay, Penn State, right, they were a top 10 team to start out. Now they're 0-5? So, I mean, that was a 13-point win for the Buckeyes. The Rutgers game was kind of close. Their defense didn't look great. I think the biggest thing for Ohio State is their defense has not been what it normally is, right? They gave up 17 to Nebraska, 25 to Penn State, 27 to Rutgers, 35 to Indiana. And Indiana's a pretty decent football team. But I don't think they're necessarily any more talented than, let's say, a Penn State. Because Penn State's got talent, man. They're signing, 4 or 5 stars. I mean, Penn State has talent. They recruit well. James Franklin, he's a likable guy, and they do well on the recruiting boards. The difference is that Penn State didn't show up to that game with any sort of mindset that they could win. Right? Penn State did not go into that game confident. They were coming off of a heartbreaker, fluke kind of, just unbelievable finish against Indiana. They felt like their season was kind of already over before it began, and they weren't enthused at all to play that game. Now, Indiana playing Ohio State. They were really enthusiastic about playing that game. So they played inspired. They played close. They made some mistakes, certainly, but they played to win the game, right? Go back to, what was it, Herm Edwards? You play to win the game. And so, for Ohio State, right, there's 4 games. There's Nebraska, there's Penn State, there's Rutgers, and there's Indiana, because the Maryland game was obviously canceled. In addition to this, we only have 3 games left on the slate for the Buckeyes. At Illinois, at Michigan State, and Michigan at home. I mean, that's just what I think when I look at that schedule. I go, oh my God, what can they prove? And the answer is really nothing. So that leads us into this discussion of, if Ohio State finishes 7-0, which they're, I would say, extremely likely to do at this point, I don't see Indiana, Michigan State, or Michigan posing any. They're gonna roll over, dead in the street. Okay, Ohio State's just gonna show up, and those 3 teams are just gonna roll over dead. It's not gonna be close. They're gonna be blowouts. If that happens, and Ohio State is 7-0, they go to a Big Ten championship. They go to the Big Ten championship, and right now Northwestern is 5-0 in conference play, and the closest team behind him is Wisconsin at 2-1, who has, I think, another game against Minnesota this weekend that's been canceled. So you got to assume it's Northwestern. Northwestern has more wins right now than Ohio State. Now they've played more games, but still, it's the Wildcats' division to lose, and I don't see it happening. I just don't see it happening. Again, it's my understanding of the way it works this year is that you still need the same number of wins to surpass. If Northwestern were to lose a game and then be 5-1, I don't think Wisconsin could overtake them unless they reached, a 5-1 record, or if they didn't hold the tiebreaker, 6-1 record. And that's not going to happen with Wisconsin. And then the next closest teams are Iowa at 3-2 and Purdue at 2-2. They're not catching Northwestern. Northwestern is going to represent the West this year in the Big Ten. So you can already go ahead and chalk it in. It's Ohio State and Northwestern in the Big Ten championship game. And maybe Northwestern shows up inspired. Maybe they show up with a can't be denied attitude like Indiana did. They are not as talented as Ohio State, and they are not going to beat the Buckeyes. At least they shouldn't. They shouldn't. So again, the sake of this example is to illustrate. Okay, Ohio State's 7-0 regular season, right? They clean house. Shouldn't be difficult at all. They clean the house. They go to the Big Ten championship game. They play Northwestern. Maybe it's a close game, less than 10 point, whatever. Doesn't really matter, right? They're 8-0, and they're like, hey, we deserve to be in the playoff. And they're going to get into the playoff. They're going to get into the playoff. I think they're going to stay at 4. I don't think Ohio State is going to leapfrog an ACC champion, even if it's a Clemson one-loss ACC champion, and I don't think they're going to leapfrog Notre Dame. And I'll tell you why I think that is. I think the committee in the past has shown they don't really want 2 teams from the same conference to be in the national championship game. Now, would it be really, really, really weird to have Clemson and Notre Dame play each other 3 times in one season? Yeah, that would be. Has that ever happened? I don't know if it's ever happened, but between 2 teams, but maybe it has. I don't know. Here's the thing, though. If Clemson, let's say, goes to the ACC championship game, Notre Dame goes to the ACC championship game, right? For the sake of simplicity in this example, Clemson were to win if they're full strength. I don't think that's a stretch. I really don't. I think Clemson played very well on the road. I thought their freshman quarterback played outstanding on the road. 2 overtimes, and the Fighting Irish were at home, and they barely scraped by. So, and again, Clemson had a lot of mistakes in that game. A lot of mistakes. Still have to give Notre Dame credit, but I think Clemson takes care of Notre Dame in a neutral location at full strength. I don't think that's a stretch to say. And Clemson plays well. There's the key. So if Clemson were to win the ACC championship game, right? Alabama's at 1. They're a lock at 1. Lock them in. Unless they lose a game, they are number 1. They're going to the playoff as number 1. You can bet your butt on it. So Alabama's at 1. I think Clemson would probably leapfrog Notre Dame, and they would be at 2. I think Notre Dame's going to sit at 3. I don't think Ohio State would leapfrog Notre Dame because Notre Dame's resume, I feel like, would be more impressive. They'd have won more games. I think they would have played more top 25 opponents. Ohio State right now they're only scheduled to play 2 ranked teams. 2 ranked teams this year. Penn State, who was 18th at the time of the game, which we can't even count that as a ranked game because it's Penn State and they're 0-5. So it's Indiana. Indiana is the only ranked team on the Buckeyes' schedule this season. Now, if you go and you look at Notre Dame, the Fighting Irish this season have beaten Clemson, right? Number 1 in the country when they played them. Clemson's first loss as the number 1 team in the country in the regular season. First loss as the number 1 team in the regular season. Notre Dame did it against Clemson. And they're going to play UNC this weekend, who's 19th. I think UNC's more impressive than Penn State, don't you? I do. I mean, UNC's had their ups and downs. They've had their moments, certainly on the road. Florida State, they've had their moments. But I think the Tar Heels are a more put-together team than Penn State, especially at the time of the game. Big distinction there. Time of the game. At the time of the game, UNC is going to be more put together than Penn State was when they played Ohio State. So, for those reasons, I would say Notre Dame stays at 3, Ohio State's at 4, and then Alabama's going to play Ohio State. Clemson would play Notre Dame in another rematch, back-to-back games. Is that a stretch? Maybe, but it could happen. It could certainly happen. Now, I could see a scenario where Ohio State does jump Notre Dame, and they end at 3rd, and Notre Dame's at 4, and then Alabama's going to play Notre Dame, and Clemson plays Ohio State. I just don't think it's as likely because in the off chance that Clemson and Notre Dame both prevail in their semifinals, you'd have Clemson and Notre Dame basically playing for the 3rd time this season in the national championship game. It just would feel weird. It would feel weird. You'd have a regular season game, you'd have an ACC championship game, and then you'd have a national championship game between the same 2 teams. And I just don't think that's what the committee wants this year, or any year, really. So I feel like it's a much more. I think the placement of Ohio State at 4 is intentional. It's intentional because the committee is setting up an opportunity for if Clemson were to prevail in the ACC championship game, they end up in that 2nd spot. Notre Dame falls to 3rd, and then we have our little semifinal round 3, if you will. Because I just don't think they're going to play each other in the national. They're not going to want them to play each other in the national championship game. Taking a moment out of the top 4 here because I know we spent a lot of time on it, but it's definitely the most interesting, right? We only care about who's in the top 4. Who's at 24 doesn't really matter unless you're a fan of that team. But the top 4, there's a lot of intrigue, there's a lot of controversy. I use that word hesitantly around Clemson being at 3. I don't really think it's a controversy. Again, I know I'm a little partial, but at the same time, I think if you just objectively compare these 2 teams on paper, you can't say Ohio State has accomplished significantly more to deserve to be 3rd. Like, Clemson has lost a game, certainly, but they didn't have their quarterback. They didn't have 3 stars on defense. And who has Ohio State played that would warrant them being at 3? Indiana? Is that it? Like, that's your argument? Now, Buckeye fans, they'll make their arguments, as delusional as they may be. But again, let's move away from the top 4 for a second. Texas A&M at 5, I don't really think they're not a threat at all. They're not a threat at all. They lost to Alabama. Alabama holds the tiebreaker in the West. There's a couple of pundits that may say, or that have said, if Texas A&M, they went out, they're 1 loss, they have a shot, long shot. No. Florida's got a better shot, and Florida's sitting at 6. Because if Florida upsets Alabama in the SEC championship game, they're going to get into the playoff. And I would say Alabama would probably get in, and Notre Dame, or whoever loses the ACC championship game, would not get in that situation, right? You'd have 2 teams from the SEC, you'd have Ohio State, and then you'd have the winner of the ACC championship, either Notre Dame or Clemson. And I honestly think that if Clemson wins the ACC championship game, even if Notre Dame has that win in the regular season, they get bumped out, and Florida gets put in, which I don't think is the right decision. But that's what they're going to do. That's what they're going to do. Because if Florida beats the almighty Alabama, we must put them in. We must put them in. Which then would bring a whole discussion about, okay, the only undefeated team is Ohio State. In that scenario, right? Alabama would have a loss. Clemson would have a loss, assuming they win the ACC championship against Notre Dame. And Florida would have a loss. They lost earlier this season. So the only undefeated team would be Ohio State at 8-0. And to see the committee not put them at number 1 would be incredible. It would be honestly incredible. And it would, I think, to be the right call, because I don't think Ohio State would deserve to be the number 1 team in the country. Having played fewer games and a really crappy schedule. Big Ten this year has just been a bust. So there's Texas A&M and Florida at 5 and 6. It's again, I think 6 is more threatening than 5 to make a move. I think 5's just kind of living there in the ether. I don't think they're really going to matter. Cincinnati at 7. I think that's about where I expected them to be. The Bearcats have played really well. Again, they're 8-0 in the American. Impressive wins. I've watched them now several times, trying to get a gauge on how they would match up against a Clemson or an Ohio State or a Florida or an A&M. How that would go, and I think the Bearcats would be a pretty good opponent. What's really interesting to me is putting Georgia at 9. Now the Bulldogs are the highest ranked 2-loss team. The other really odd decision is to have Oklahoma at 11. Oklahoma's a 2-loss team. They're 6-2, and we all remember, at least I do. Maybe the committee doesn't remember. But I'll remind the committee that Oklahoma lost 38-35 to Kansas State, 37-30 to Iowa State, and they nearly lost to Texas, right? It took what was that, 3 or 4 overtimes? It was 4 overtimes. It was a 4-overtime game. And they finally beat the Longhorns. Now, Texas is... are they in these initial... I think they are in the initial rankings here. Let me go back. I'm not as concerned about Texas. I'm really more shocked that Oklahoma is sitting here at 11. Okay, yeah, no, Texas is 17th. They're at 17th. So you have a lot of Big 12 teams, a lot of 2-loss Big 12 teams, and they're trying. You can tell they're either trying to get them in the top 15, or they're just kind of fan servicing that conference and being like, here you go, here's a top 15 slot. It's not going to matter. It's not going to matter. You're not going to make it, but here you go. Right? Because Oklahoma at 6-2 at 11th, Iowa State at 6-2 and 13th, Texas at 5-2 at 17th, Oklahoma State at 5-2 and 23rd. These guys aren't making the playoff, man. They're not making the playoff. Oklahoma State's out of it 100%. Texas is out of it 100%. Oklahoma, there's no way. There's no way. Not with losses to, again, This is the committee for you. Oklahoma lost to Iowa State, right? They lost to Iowa State, and they're 11th, and Iowa State is 13th. How? What? How do you put the Sooners at 11, and you put the Cyclones at 13, and they have the same record, but Iowa State beat Oklahoma? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I will tell you the one thing that really shocked me with these rankings was the disrespect to BYU. And I'm sure you've heard about it at this point. You've seen it, right? BYU at 14th, 9-0, behind teams like Iowa State, Oklahoma, Indiana, Georgia. Hell, even Northwestern at 5-0 is in 8th. Come on. Are you this slanted towards Power 5 that you're going to put the leading team in the Big Ten West at 8 just so, you can have a top 10 matchup in the Big Ten Championship? Come on. See, that's having Northwestern at 8. That's more for Ohio State's benefit than Northwestern's. Northwestern's not the 8th best team in the country. Now, I've seen the Wildcats play. Pat Fitzgerald, he's a great coach. Pat Fitzgerald is a great coach, and he's building a good culture and a good program at Northwestern, but they are not a top 10 team right now. They might be top 20. They're not top 10. BYU, I think, would beat the brakes off of Northwestern. So, I mean, I think Oklahoma would beat Northwestern. I think Miami would beat Northwestern. I think Georgia would beat Northwestern. I think Indiana may give them a really good game. I think Iowa State would give them a really good game. Wisconsin, I think. Well, again, they're in the same conference. We're trying to pick out a conference. I think Oregon, maybe. Oregon's been a little slow in a lot of their games, and they've definitely gone down the wire. It still have a 3-0 record. But the point is that I don't understand how you can have Northwestern at 8. I mean, what? That just doesn't make any sense. If you're going to have BYU at 14, and they've played 4 more games. They're 9-0. Problem for BYU is they're an independent. They're an independent, and their name is not Notre Dame, and so they're not going to get the recognition they deserve. I think, again, Zach Wilson, BYU's quarterback, I mean, he's played lights out all season. I think the Cougars are a legitimate threat to anyone at the top right now. I think they could go toe-to-toe with a lot of really good teams. And I don't think that's because they're just as talented. I think it's because they believe that they could go and play anybody and have a chance. And hope's a dangerous thing. And so, again, having the Cougars down there at 14 is almost like an afterthought, was so disrespectful. And I just don't understand that decision at all. BYU is definitely a top 10 team. I don't understand how you could put Northwestern and Georgia, a 2-loss Georgia, in the top 10 and not have the BYU Cougars. Absolutely mind-blowing. But again, you know, I talked about this, right? I still feel like as things shake out right now, Cincinnati, non-Power 5 teams, Cincinnati has the best shot. I just don't think BYU is going to get there, fair or unfair. I think it's unfair for them, but I think Cincinnati at 7. There is an opportunity for them. Big story, though, from this weekend, I would say, is Clemson sitting at 3, Ohio State at 4, which, again, is a flip of the AP poll because the Buckeyes are still at 3rd in the AP poll. But thankfully, we don't have to reference the AP poll anymore this season. I'm so excited that I don't have to look at that anymore. So we'll see. We'll see how some of this shakes out. Again, obviously, there's a lot of games left to be played. We played a lot of hypotheticals in this segment. And, you know, these teams still have to win games, right? Clemson has still got to go win their games. Alabama's still got to win their game against Auburn this weekend. You know, Notre Dame has to take care of North Carolina. Ohio State is going to need to not sleep on Illinois, Michigan State, Michigan. LOL. I mean, if you were to ask me who has the easiest path to the playoff right now, it's Ohio State, man. It's Ohio State. They're going to play 8 games. They don't play anybody good, and they're going to walk in. They may not walk in first, but they're going to walk into the playoff. Ohio State's going to walk into the playoff undefeated, having faced literally no one, except for Indiana, who gave them a challenge, and they're going to be pretty well rested. So it really, I think it's really to their benefit that they started this season so late. We talked about the Big Ten bias, actually, when their season started, and people were already putting, like, I think Ohio State had like a couple first-place votes in the AP poll after their first game of the season. It was like, what? Like, no, you can't, no. We're in like week 8 of the season at this point, and you're putting a team that's played one game in number, like, no. Either way, though, I'm sure the playoff committee will throw a few more curveballs, a few more surprises our way, and I'm excited for it. I think this was a good opening slate of rankings. A few surprises, a few things that weren't surprises, but overall, it was pretty interesting stuff. All right, let's take a break. Come back. We're gonna dive into the second segment of the show. Touch briefly on Nick Saban and his positive COVID-19 diagnosis. That's next. Welcome back to the show. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to After Further Review. I am Jay Smith. And again, I appreciate you listening, whether it's on the podcast. You can listen to AFR on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcast. All you got to do is search After Further Review, and you can subscribe, download all the episodes straight to your phone. Or if you're watching on Facebook, again, the Facebook page for the show is After Further Review, and all of our episodes are back cataloged there. You can watch anytime you want to. Okay, so Alabama has announced that Coach Nick Saban has tested positive again for COVID-19. This time, though, he is showing symptoms. So it has been confirmed that he will not be coaching on the sidelines for the Auburn game this weekend. I believe he is showing very mild symptoms. That is how the university phrased it. That's a direct quote. Very mild symptoms. So because he's symptomatic, there is no opportunity for this to be a false positive, right? He has to go into quarantine. He has to go through all the protocol. And this was I believe, this was this morning. So Wednesday morning is when this was announced. And, as of right now, there have been no other coaches or players on the Alabama team that have received positive tests. Gus Malzahn put out a statement, wishing a speedy recovery. How does this change the Iron Bowl, though? That's the real discussion, I think. Is obviously, first and foremost, we hope that Nick Saban recovers and beats it and has no lasting ramifications, right? That's the first. That's the number one thing. So hopefully he recovers soon. Wishing him all the best. How does it affect the game? Well, I think it won't necessarily have a huge impact because, as we all probably realize at this point, Saban and his program and his coaches and the way he runs things, it's such a well-oiled machine. And because Saban's such a perfectionist, there's no doubt that this type of scenario has been, brought up and planned for, right? They've been like, okay, what if this happens? What if coach isn't available for a game? I bet they had this plan years ago. I mean, I'm sure almost all schools do. Like if coach is sick or something happens, day of a game or before, and the head coach isn't there, what do you do? So Alabama, I don't think will really skip a step. They're focused on what they need to do. They're focused on the task at hand. Auburn also has shown a lot of inconsistency this year. And listen, I picked the Tigers to win the West this season. I was high on Bo Nix. I thought he played great as a freshman. I've been disappointed in his performance this year. We'll see how the Tigers look next year. But I totally own that I had the Auburn Tigers in the ACC championship game playing Florida, and I might be 1 for 2. I might have Florida in there, right? But Alabama right now is the better team out of the West. And again, I mean, obviously Saban's going to have to isolate for 10 days. His return will be December 4th, which is one day before the season finale game against Arkansas on the road. And obviously Steve Sarkisian, the offensive coordinator, is going to step up, fulfill the role of head coach. And this guy, he's been head coach at USC, at Washington, and he had the head coach duties when Saban tested positive in October. So I don't think there's going to be a huge change here, right? Sarkisian's still going to play. He's still going to play call on offense. He's still going to call all the plays. Now, reading here further, it does say that rules prohibit coaches from participating in game day activities remotely, but he can be part of preparations like leading video conferences and watching practice. So this man, even if he's symptomatic, even if he's not feeling his best, he's going to devote time to the team. And you got to think that Alabama is going to go in focused on the task at hand. And I don't really foresee this being a major issue for them. I think Alabama would still, perform the same if he was there or if he wasn't there. Now, the big thing is if Auburn shows up inspired, which this is the Iron Bowl, anything can happen, as we've seen over the years, whether it's the kick six or any other iconic ending. And if things start to go the Tigers' way, it'll be interesting to see how Alabama adjusts without Nick Saban present, right? Because Saban's not going to be there on Saturday. So Sarkisian and the rest of that coaching staff for the Crimson Tide are going to have to make adjustments based off what they see Auburn do. The real question for Auburn is Bo Nix going to play well, and can they force turnovers? Auburn really hasn't been able to do either of those things very consistently this season, and it's hurt them. And that's part of the reason that that Auburn's not where Alabama is right now. I think that Alabama should show up inspired to play, and I don't think this is going to have a huge impact on this particular game. Now we'll see. I mean, again, you never know. This is the Iron Bowl, but Auburn, again, sitting at 5-2. I just, I haven't seen enough from them consistently this season. I mean, the losses to Georgia and South Carolina were really bad. I mean, really bad. I do not understand how Auburn lost to South Carolina in the manner that they did. But even the games against Ole Miss was really close. You could argue the Rebels should have won that game. The Tennessee game was kind of ugly. The Kentucky game at the beginning of the season took a while for Auburn to get going offensively. So they've had a lot of consistency issues. And unless they have just magically turned something around, I think you got to pick the Tide in this one. So I think Alabama will take care of this game pretty easily. Okay, all right, one last break, and when we come back, we'll wrap up the show, do a little Egg Bowl preview, and we'll pick each of the college pick'em matchups for Week 10 of the pick'em season. That is next. You don't want to miss it. Welcome back to the show, final segment of this episode of After Further Review. And we got the Egg Bowl to talk about. Man, I am hyped for this Egg Bowl. I got some friends that are coming into town this weekend, and we are going to have a great time. First Egg Bowl between Mike Leach's Mississippi State Bulldogs and Lane Kiffin's Ole Miss Rebels. And it figures to be, I think, an interesting game. I think it's going to be a really interesting game. I honestly think that Ole Miss will prevail, and I'm going to talk about that here in a second. I'll get into a little bit of the X's and O's. Look, first-year head coaches in the SEC always have a rough go of it, right? There's rarely a head coach in the SEC that's a first-year guy, especially at a program that's been struggling recently, that's been, not able to get to those 500 win like that it takes a few years. It takes a few years to get anywhere and to progress. Mike Leach has got Mississippi State at 2-5. The LSU game, and here's the thing. Here's the thing for Mississippi State, right? The LSU game at the beginning of the season shocked people. It shocked me. I mean, I was like, holy cow. Like, LSU just got obliterated by Mississippi State at home. Are these Bulldogs, are they a legit top 25 team? Well, no, not exactly. And their only other win this season has been Vanderbilt. They won that 24-17. The rest of it's been ugly. The rest of it's been really ugly. They lost to Georgia last week, 31-24. They lost to Alabama, 41-0. They lost to Texas A&M, 28-14. They lost to Kentucky, 24-2. The Bulldogs are only averaging 17 points a game, and they average allowing 28. So that should tell you right there, okay, these guys are well below 500, and that 2-5 record confirms that. On offense, they have really struggled more than I think was expected. They only average about 329 yards, about 330 yards of total offense. And what's really shocking is 300 of that's coming through the air. They only 21 yards on the ground per game for Mississippi State. They can't run the ball at all. They're as one-dimensional as it gets. And so, yeah, you can throw for 300 yards in the air, but it's like Georgia Tech, right? Like, they're going to run the ball. They're going to do a triple option. Like, you just got to defend it. And so Mississippi State, you just got to defend against the pass. And on defense, they're more stout against the run. They average allowing about 100 yards rushing a game and about 256 through the air. But either way, the Bulldogs have certainly, I think, been more of a disappointment this season. 2-5 with wins against an LSU team that's ended up not being good at all, and Vanderbilt is probably not what Mike Leach was wanting in his first year. And I think the biggest thing, though, is that it's not just that they've lost 5 games, it's that they weren't competitive. They weren't competitive in the Kentucky game. They weren't competitive in the Alabama game. They didn't score. They weren't competitive in the A&M game and really the Georgia game either. Like Mississippi State, when they've lost, it's been bad. It's been really bad. And for Ole Miss, when they've lost, right, Ole Miss is still below 500. They're 3-4. Lane Kiffin has had his moments. There's definitely been, I think, a little bit more positive energy around the program, though. You can tell a difference. Here's the key. When Ole Miss loses, it's close, right? The loss to Alabama, 63-48. It was close until like 7 minutes left in the fourth quarter. The Auburn game, 35-28. It was close. It was within reach. Okay, 41-0 for Mississippi State against Alabama. That is not within reach. Okay, 24-2, Mississippi State losing to Kentucky. That's not within reach. So Ole Miss has been within reach in a lot of these games, and they're sitting there almost at 500, and I think there's a good chance they win this game. You got to talk about the Rebels offense, though. My goodness. Matt Corral for a few weeks was a turnover machine. Okay, he's thrown 9 picks on the year, but the guy is 162 for 219 for 2,400 yards, 22 touchdowns, and 9 picks. And then Ely on the ground, 117 carries, 608 yards, 8 TDs, and Elijah Moore, their leading receiver, with 74 receptions, over 1,000 yards receiving, and 8 touchdowns. The Rebels are averaging 41 points a game, 560 yards of total offense, 350 in the air, 212 on the ground. That is 10 times the amount of rushing yards per game that Mississippi State's getting. Mississippi State, 21 yards on the ground a game. Ole Miss, 212. These guys are balanced, and they're dangerous. And a team that's balanced and has playmakers, Matt Corral, Jerrion Ely, Elijah Moore, it's dangerous. Now, the weakness of Ole Miss is defense, and it is a weakness. It is god-awful to watch. Ole Miss's defense allows over 530 yards a game, nearly 300 yards passing, but worst of all, 240 yards of rushing allowed per game. That is awful. 240 yards allowed on the ground a game. And so when you look at this, you go, oh, Ole Miss is averaging 41 points per game. They allow, on average, 40.9 points per game. 1/10 of a point difference in points per game versus points allowed. So, how does Ole Miss win football games? They outscore their opponents. The defense doesn't exist. It's like they're not even there. It's like, okay, the other team has the ball. Can we prevent them from getting it all in one play? Okay, can we prevent them from getting it all in 2 plays? Can we do it for a 3rd play? Oh, no, they scored. That's Ole Miss's defense right now. Now, DJ Durkin has his work cut out for him. He's going to start recruiting. I think the defense will improve. I think the talent will improve. Lane Kiffin's going to draw names. He's a recruiting genius. The man has got charisma. He's funny. He's humorous. I've watched a lot of his press conferences. He's a great guy to listen to, and I think he's a fun guy, and I think a lot of the players really love playing for him. And the talent's coming. Talent's coming to Oxford. Just give it 3 or 4 years. Give it a little bit of time. Talent's coming to Oxford. So for Ole Miss, is this a must-win game? Well, it's a rivalry game. It's an important game. It's a game that fans want to win. I don't think Ole Miss's season is a failure if they lose this game. Okay, Mississippi State, if they lose this game, they go to 2-6. It's starting to feel like a failure. It's starting to feel like okay, all right, year 2 of Mike Leach, here we go. Mississippi State fans are already looking to next year, right? They're already kind of over this season. Ole Miss fans aren't. Ole Miss fans are 3-4. They're pretty happy. The student population, the local population here, people are happy with the state of the football program. Yes, they're 3-4. They're not even 500, but it's a different vibe. It's a different feel. It's an energy that was not here last year under Matt Luke, and I think that's for the better for the Rebels. So again, I think Ole Miss prevails in the Egg Bowl. I think they win this one convincingly by 2 scores or more. And I think it's kind of a great way to cap off a stellar first year under Lane Kiffin on offense. Defense, whole other discussion, lots of issues, need to get that fixed, most certainly. If you're ever going to compete in the SEC West, you must have a really good defense. Neither of these teams have one. So this is really a battle between 2 teams kind of near the bottom of their conference, but I think it should still be a good game. And if you're a fan of either of these teams, even if you're not, who doesn't want to tune in and watch Mike Leach and Lane Kiffin head? That's going to be fantastic. I cannot wait for these post-game press conferences. It's going to be great. It's going to be a lot of fun. Okay, let's go ahead and wrap up the show. Let's talk some Week 10 college pick'em league picks. Let's go through these very quickly. Wrap up the show quick. First up, we got Maryland and Indiana. Indiana looking to bounce back after their loss to Ohio State. Maryland's been sneaky. Maryland has been sneaky this year. They are 2-1, and they have wins against Terrapins have wins against Penn State and Minnesota. Now, Penn State obviously has turned out to be a flop. Minnesota certainly has not proven to be what was expected of them, and it took overtime for Maryland to beat them. The Terrapins lost bad to Northwestern, 43-3 at the season opening game on October 24th. I think Indiana prevails in this one. I think they bounce back, they get it done. But this is going to be closer than a lot of people think. And I think, if you're Indiana, don't write this one off. Show up, play the Terrapins for 4 quarters. All right, let's go to the Big 12. We got Texas Tech and Oklahoma State. Again, the Cowboys kind of at this point, they're 5-2, 21st in the college football playoff rankings. They feel like the season probably slipped away from them. I know that Mike Gundy has voiced some frustration with some inconsistencies from his team this year. And you got to feel for them because the Cowboys always seem so close, but they're always, they're like the little brother to Oklahoma. I mean, they're just kind of there. And even Texas, right? Like Oklahoma State's always kind of that third rung of the ladder. And I don't think Texas Tech, a 3-5 team that's struggled a lot this season, is going to beat the Cowboys. But again, just like we talked about with this previous game for Indiana and Maryland, Oklahoma State needs to show up for 4 quarters. They need to take care of business, and they need to add another win to their win column. So I'm going Cowboys in that matchup. Okay, Kent State and Buffalo. And this is an interesting game. These two teams are 3-0. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, how much do you really know about Kent State and Buffalo? And to be honest with you, I've not watched either of these teams play this year, but I can tell you that that Buffalo has looked impressive. They've got wins against Northern Illinois, Miami, Ohio, and Bowling Green. Kent State, the Golden Flashes, have wins against Eastern Michigan, Bowling Green, and Akron. Now, Kent State's offense has been fantastic. These guys are averaging 52 points a game, 600 yards of offense. Buffalo averaging the 44 points a game and about 460 yards of total offense. Both of their defenses are about the same caliber. They usually allow about 350 yards total, most of it being through the air, about 200 yards through the air. So I don't think the defenses are really going to set these teams apart. It's the offenses. And if Kent State is able to maintain their level of offensive performance, like we've seen from them so far this season, I think it bodes really well for them. Again, when you compare common opponents, the only one they have is Bowling Green, and both of these teams played Bowling Green on the road. Buffalo played them last week, won 42-17. Kent State played them the week prior, won 62-24. So I'm gonna go with the Golden Flashes. Should be a really good game though. I think it's gonna be close. This is a noon kickoff on CBS Sports Network. I don't think it's going to have a large audience, but it's still, I think it's going to be a good game. It's really interesting. Right now, about 85% are picking Buffalo, and I just wonder why. Like, just curious as to why you would pick Buffalo in that matchup, because teams look really close. I figured it'd be more 50-50, maybe 60-40. But 85-15, like that seems odd. So I'm going with Kent State. I'm going to go Kent State here. Okay, Iron Bowl. We got Auburn and Alabama. Now, I've talked about this game earlier in the show. Obviously, Nick Saban's not going to be coaching. I still think Alabama prevails. They see the opportunity ahead of them, right? They see the college football playoff berth and all that looming. They want to move on to the SEC championship game. Auburn's going to try and play spoiler. And who knows? This is the Iron Bowl, but the safe pick here is Alabama. I'm going to go with the Tide. All right, Colorado and USC. Switching over to the Pac-12. USC has had their moments this season where they look like they may not pull through, but they're 3-0 in the top 20 of the college football playoff rankings. And Colorado is 2-0, but I just don't think they have the offensive firepower to compete with USC for 4 quarters. And if the Trojans play consistently, they win this game, and they win it easily. I'm going USC. San Jose State and Boise State. We got Spartans here. San Jose State, they're 4-0. The Broncos for Boise State are 4-1. When you look at this matchup, It's certainly, I think, would favor Boise State, just with their who they've played this season. They lost to BYU a few weeks back pretty badly, 51-17, but they have good wins against Hawaii, Colorado State, Utah State, Air Force. And again, when you look at common opponents between Boise State and San Jose State, right now it's just Air Force. Boise State won 49-30. San Jose State won 17-6. And that's one of the issues with San Jose State this season has been at times their offense is pretty lackluster. They've scored over 20 points only 3 times. Excuse me, I'm looking at the schedule. No, I am looking at the schedule correctly. Yeah, they've scored over 20 points only twice. And so, again, their offense has had some issues. And so I think Boise State's a safer pick in this one. I'm going to go with the Broncos in this matchup. LSU and Texas A&M in the SEC this weekend. Look, LSU has had a rough year, but somehow they're still 3-3. They're 500. A&M is sitting at 5. They're 5-1 with that loss to Alabama back in week 2. They need to win games. They need to pad their stats. They need to boost their resume. I think it's all for naught. I'm not sure it's really going to have a big impact on their final college football playoff placement in the rankings. I'm going to pick the Aggies. They're certainly the more put together team, but again, how much will this really matter for A&M? Probably not very much. All right, 2 games left. We got Georgia and South Carolina. Now, the Gamecocks are 2-6. Their season fell apart, right? They fired Will Muschamp about a week ago. I think Mike Bobo is now stepped in as the interim head coach. It's really been a rocky few years for the Gamecocks. There has just been a lot. They've had some bright moments. They beat Auburn earlier this year. Muschamp has saved his job on multiple occasions with surprise wins against ranked teams. That's not happening this weekend. Bulldogs, I think, plow over South Carolina, and they take care of business. This one right now is 98% of the country picking Georgia. I think that's the correct pick. All right, last matchup, we got Oklahoma and West Virginia. Now, the Sooners, again, we touched on this earlier in the show. They are 14th right now in the college football playoff rankings. West Virginia is 5-3. So Oklahoma needs to continue to win. They need to continue to boost the resume. And they have certainly turned things around from where they were earlier this year with losses to Kansas State and Iowa State. I've liked what I've seen from Oklahoma. Recently, I thought they played well against Oklahoma State the week prior. And I expect them to win this game and continue to kind of turn things around. It's gonna be a high scoring game, and you know that Oklahoma and any Big 12 game is going to be a super high scoring game. But I still expect them to prevail. So those are the picks for this week's matchups. Again, if we look at the standings really quick before we go off air here, it's close. It's really, really tight. Still, myself and Aaron Long tied at the top of the leaderboard, 56 total points. And then there's a bit of a drop-off now. Third place, Hannah Reagan's got 48. Jackson Wright's tied for third place with Hannah at 48. And then fifth place is Razorback 11 with 44 points. And it's been really good weeks. The last couple of weeks have been really good for some people and really bad for others. Because if you remember, back in week 6 and 7, the leaderboard had 10 people within 3 points of each other. And now it has just really spread out. And again, a lot of these games are toss-ups and they're tough to pick. But hey, I'm giving you my analysis before each of them. So you have no excuse, right? If you listen to the podcast, you would know who you should really pick in these matchups, or at least who I'm picking. But either way, that has been it for this edition of After Further Review. Obviously, Thanksgiving is tomorrow, so happy Thanksgiving to everybody, or if you're listening to the episode after Thanksgiving, I hope you had a great Thanksgiving. I know where I'll be tomorrow. I'll be watching the parade. I'm going to be watching the dog show. I'm going to be eating a lot of food, watching a lot of football, and I'm going to be enjoying my time off, and you should as well. So take care. Enjoy the college football this weekend. We'll see you next week. I'm Jay Smith, and this has been After Further Review.